Ukraine's president says Russian troops are still making some attempts to advance. That's despite Vladimir Putin announcing an Easter ceasefire. President Zelensky says Russia's only trying to create the impression of a ceasefire, with Ukrainian forces reporting shelling and a number of assaults along the front line on Easter morning. It was an unexpected announcement of a 30-hour ceasefire by the Russian president, and in a message issued a few hours after it was due to begin, the Ukrainian leader said Russia's assault was ongoing in several places, but that his country would honour the ceasefire if Russia did. This was shortly after Russia's announcement, the sound of air raids across Ukraine's capital. President Zelensky says if a ceasefire does hold, it should extend beyond Easter. That's a sentiment that's been echoed by the British Foreign Office, with a statement saying now's the moment for Putin to truly show he's serious about peace by ending his horrible invasion and committing to a full ceasefire, as the Ukrainian government has called for, not just a one-day pause for Easter. Our correspondent in Moscow, Steve Rosenberg, sent this report.
President Putin had summoned one of his most senior military officials for a battleground briefing. Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, told him that Russian forces were advancing. The situation is going well for Russia, the Kremlin leader concluded, but then a surprise announcement of a unilateral Russian ceasefire, albeit a short one.
Out of humanitarian considerations, starting tonight from 6 p.m. to midnight on Sunday night, Russia is declaring an Easter truce. I order a stop to all military activities during this period. We assume the Ukrainian side will follow our example.
The ceasefire announcement came a day after President Trump indicated he was growing impatient and might stop trying to broker a peace deal.
If for some reason one of the two parties makes it very difficult, we're just going to say you're foolish, you're fools, you're horrible people, and we're going to just take a pass.
Could a 30-hour ceasefire be a first step towards ending what has begun to feel like an endless war? The Kremlin's critics are skeptical. There is no trust in words coming from Moscow, was President Zelensky's reaction. President Putin's Easter truce falls far short of what America had originally been pushing for, a 30-day comprehensive ceasefire, which Ukraine had agreed to. Nevertheless, the Kremlin will use it to try to convince the White House that it is serious about peace, that it does want to end the war, more than 3 years after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Earlier, Russia and Ukraine carried out a swap involving more than 500 prisoners of war. Exchanges like this have continued throughout the war. On this, Moscow and Kiev have been able to reach agreement. What political leaders have so far failed to agree on is a path to peace. After declaring an Easter ceasefire, Vladimir Putin attended an Easter service in Moscow's main cathedral. Russia's president wants the world to believe that he, the leader who ordered troops into Ukraine, is serious now about ending hostilities. The world is watching to see whether a brief truce will bring peace closer. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Well, Charles Kupchan is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he formerly served as the Senior Director for European Affairs at the US National Security Council. He says this pause is more of an attempt for Vladimir Putin to suggest he's on the side of peace after Donald Trump's team suggested they may walk away from peace talks if there's no movement soon.
Some small step is better than no step. The problem is, going back to 2014 when the Russians first went into Crimea and Donbass, we've seen pauses before and all of them disappeared quite quickly. You know, I don't think we should throw in the towel. I think that Trump should stay the course and try to negotiate an end to the war. And I don't think it's a futile effort in the sense that, you know, Putin wants a good relationship with Trump. Putin would like to come in from the cold. The problem is that I think by undermining Ukraine, by saying to the Ukrainians, we're going to walk away from you, maybe we're not going to give you weapons anymore, Trump is in some ways making his goal more elusive because he's weakening Ukraine's strength at the negotiating table when he should be strengthening it.
Charles Kupchan there from the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, let's go to Ukraine now. This is St. Michael's Monastery right in the centre of Kiev, just after 10 in the morning there. People have been gathering over the last couple of hours to celebrate Easter Mass today. This is the monastery, as I say, right in the heart of Kiev. The blue walls and the beautiful golden domes that we often see in those backdrop shots of the Ukrainian capital. Now, in the first 6 hours of this so-called Easter truce today, there have been reportedly 387 shellings and 19 assaults by the Russian army. That's according to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He also says that drones have been used 290 times. Now, the BBC's not been able to independently verify these reports. These attacks mainly on the front lines. We've, I don't think, had any reports of strikes in Kiev itself. This comes after this Easter truce that was ordered by President Putin on Saturday. We heard from our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg in his report earlier, and he's joining us live now from Moscow. Steve, good morning. Many people complaining that this Easter truce is just for show. It's not much of a show if these attacks are continuing.
Well, that's right. I haven't seen any reports from Russian officials yet about their take on how the ceasefire is going. Obviously, we've seen what President Zelensky has said, saying that there have been attacks going on. President Putin, when he announced this surprise truce, unilateral truce yesterday, spoke about being motivated by humanitarian considerations. I think that phrase will have sparked a lot of suspicion in Ukraine and skepticism after more than 3 years of Russia's war against Ukraine. I think on the one hand, Kremlin skeptics, Kremlin critics would call this ceasefire PR. They would argue that this is an attempt to do the minimum to persuade President Trump that Russia is serious about peace and that Ukraine is not serious about peace. Now, keep in mind that the Americans had been pushing for this 30-day comprehensive ceasefire from both Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine had agreed to that. Russia didn't agree to that or put lots of conditions to that. Instead, it's come up with this 30-hour ceasefire, and it did so without any warning, really, giving neither side really any time to prepare for this. Having said that, this ceasefire didn't come out of nowhere. There's been a lot of diplomatic activity in recent weeks to try to end the fighting in Ukraine. We've seen Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, hold 3 meetings with President Putin in the last couple of months. We've seen President Putin's envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, go to Washington for talks. A few days ago, we saw Mr. Witkoff and the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in Paris, holding talks on Ukraine with President Macron. And there was a delegation from Ukraine there too. And on top of that, the White House has been dropping hints that it's getting impatient. It wants to see progress on Ukraine peace. Otherwise, it might walk away from the table. Then we get this announcement of a 30-hour ceasefire from Vladimir Putin. It'll be interesting to see what happens when the ceasefire runs out, whether there is at all a tiny window of opportunity here to build on this, even though there are reports of attacks continuing, whether this is a moment to possibly build on and take a step towards peace.
Steve, arguably, President Putin hasn't heeded any calls from the United States for peace ever since it launched its full-scale invasion back in 2022. Is it finally starting to listen to messages coming out of the White House?
It's very difficult to know exactly what is going on, right? I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg here. We don't know, we're not privy to all the conversations that are taking place behind closed doors. Just take those meetings between Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin. At the end of them, there are no big statements given to the press. We simply don't know the details of what's being talked about, how close the two sides are or how far apart in terms of a possible deal. But we do know that Donald Trump was getting impatient at the lack of progress. He was keen to get some kind of truce announced, if not by Easter, then certainly by his 100 days in office at the end of this month. President Putin has announced this 30-day ceasefire, which expires at midnight tonight. Let's see what happens once it expires, whether there will be continued attempts from all parties, America, Ukraine, Russia, Europe, to kind of continue the conversation and push towards some kind of peace deal.
Steve, we see these little pockets of agreements, the Black Sea grain agreement, a 30-hour Easter ceasefire agreement, an agreement not to strike energy targets. I wonder if instead of a big overall general ceasefire, if that's the way forward, these kind of little deals that add up and up and up.
Well, I mean, it's not clear whether they add up and up and up. I mean, you're absolutely right. There have been attempts on different tracks to reach different agreements. But the major sticking point is how to end the war in Ukraine. Up till now, President Putin has shown little sign of being willing to compromise, to make concessions. His demands haven't changed, as far as we know, since he came out with his so-called peace proposal of June last year, basically demanding not only all the territory that Russia had occupied in Ukraine, but a little bit more, demanding that Crimea be recognized as Russia, demanding that Ukraine should not join NATO. Russian officials maintain that Moscow's conditions, Moscow's demands haven't changed. As I say, we don't know all the details of what's being discussed at these high-level talks that are going on. There is diplomacy, or there has been diplomacy. So I think we just have to wait and follow events and see whether this apparently small step that President Putin has taken, this 30-hour ceasefire, leads to anything bigger.
OK, Steve, as always, really good to get your analysis. Steve Rosenberg for us there in Moscow.